That night on the Tonight Show stage, Neil Diamond put down his guitar, Jimmy Fallon couldn't speak, and 300 audience members held their breath because a sound that hadn't been heard in 40 years came from the back of the studio. It was April 2024. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Neil Diamond was the musical guest, a living legend at 83 years old, making a rare television appearance. The audience was electric with anticipation. This was the man who gave the world Sweet Caroline, Cracklin' Rosie, America. A voice that had defined generations. Jimmy had introduced him with genuine reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incomparable Neil Diamond." The applause was thunderous. Neil walked onto the stage slowly, not with the energy of his younger years, but with the dignity of someone who had earned every step. He settled onto the stool, adjusted the microphone, cradled his acoustic guitar. "I'm going to play something special tonight," Neil said, his voice still rich despite the years. "A song I wrote a long time ago. For someone who, well, you'll see." He began playing the opening chords of Sweet Caroline. The audience started singing along immediately, that infectious melody that makes strangers feel like family, that turns stadiums into living rooms. Jimmy stood beside his desk, smiling, nodding along. The roots were swaying gently. The cameras captured the joy on every face in the studio. Neil sang the first verse. His voice was older, weathered, but still carrying that unmistakable warmth. The audience swayed. Some held up phones. Others just closed their eyes and let the nostalgia wash over them. And then, from the very back of the studio, near the entrance where audience members wait before taping, a voice joined in. Not loud. Not performative. Just singing. A woman's voice, clear and true, hitting the harmony notes that most people don't even know exist in Sweet Caroline. Neil's fingers stuttered on the guitar strings. He kept playing, muscle memory carrying him through, but his head tilted slightly, like a dog hearing a familiar sound from far away. The voice continued. Still from the back. Still quiet enough that only the studio microphones were catching it, feeding it through the sound system just loud enough for Neil to hear. And then Neil Diamond stopped playing. His fingers lifted from the guitar strings. The chord hung in the air and died. His eyes closed. The studio fell into confused silence. Jimmy stopped mid-sway. The entire studio froze. The audience didn't know what was happening. Had Neil forgotten the lyrics? Was this some kind of medical issue? The man was 83. Was he okay? Jimmy took a step forward, concern crossing his face. "Neil? You all right?" Neil didn't respond. He sat on that stool, guitar resting against his leg, eyes still closed, head tilted toward the back of the studio. Listening. The woman's voice continued singing. Alone now. A cappella. The harmony line to a song she clearly knew by heart. Sweet Caroline, good times never seemed so good. Jimmy's head snapped toward the back of the studio. His eyes scanned the darkness beyond the lights, trying to find the source of the voice. And then Neil Diamond spoke, his voice barely above a whisper but caught perfectly by his microphone. "Marcia?" The singing stopped. 300 people held their breath. Neil opened his eyes. Tears were streaming down his face. His hands were shaking. He stood up slowly, carefully placing the guitar on its stand, and walked to the edge of the stage, staring out into the audience area. "Marcia, is that you?" From the back of the studio, a woman in her late 70s stepped into the aisle. The stage lights caught her face, weathered by time, but with eyes that sparkled with recognition and joy and 40 years of waiting. "Hello, Neil," she said, her voice carrying through the studio. Jimmy Fallon stood beside his desk, completely motionless, his mind racing to understand what he was witnessing. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1969. Neil Diamond wasn't always Neil Diamond, legend. In 1969, he was a rising star. Successful, yes, with several hits on the charts, but still hustling, still proving himself, still wondering if his career would last or fade like so many others. He was performing at small venues across the country. Not stadiums yet. Theaters. Music halls. Places where he could see every face in the audience. In September 1969, he played a show in Boston. A small theater near Fenway Park. Maybe 400 seats. He remembers it was raining that night. The kind of steady autumn rain that makes everything smell like wet leaves and possibility. She was in the third row. He noticed her during the second song, a young woman with dark hair and the most attentive face he'd ever seen. Not screaming like some fans. Not trying to get his attention. Just listening. Really listening. The way musicians dream of being heard. After the show, as Neil was packing up his guitar backstage, someone knocked on his dressing room door. It was her. Marcia Murphy. 23 years old. A music teacher at an elementary school in Brookline. She'd come to the show alone because none of her friends understood why she loved his music so much. "I just wanted to tell you," she said, standing in the doorway, nervous but determined, "that you sing the way I teach my students to listen. Like every word matters." Neil, exhausted from the show, found himself smiling. "How do you teach them to listen?" "I tell them to find the harmony. Everyone hears the melody." "That's easy. But the harmony is where the real beauty lives. It's the notes underneath that make the song complete." They talked for 2 hours. About music. About teaching. About the difference between performing and connecting. Marcia had this way of describing music that made Neil hear his own songs differently. Before she left, Neil asked if she'd come to his next Boston show. She came to every Boston show for the next year. They fell in love the way musicians fall in love, through sound. She taught him harmony lines he'd never noticed in his own compositions. He wrote songs with her voice in his head, imagining how she'd sing them. In 1970, they got married. A small ceremony. Just family. They honeymooned in California, and Marcia laughed when Neil said he was thinking of moving to Los Angeles to be closer to the music industry. "Wherever you go," she said, "I'll find the harmony." Their marriage lasted 5 years. Not because they stopped loving each other. Not because of infidelity or cruelty or any of the usual reasons marriages end. But because Neil's career exploded. Stadium tours. Television appearances. Recording sessions that lasted weeks. He was gone more than he was home. Marcia wanted children. A house with a piano in the living room. Students to teach. A life that had roots. Neil wanted stages. Audiences. The road. In 1975, they sat in their Los Angeles apartment and had the conversation that neither of them wanted but both knew was coming. "I can't ask you to stop," Marcia said, tears streaming down her face. "Your music matters. It reaches people. It changes them. I've seen it. And I can't ask you to keep waiting," Neil replied, holding her hands. "You deserve someone who comes home." They divorced amicably. Heartbroken but honest. Marcia moved back to Boston. Neil threw himself into his music with even more intensity, trying to fill the silence she'd left behind. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Over the next 40 years, Neil married twice more. Had children. Built a legendary career. Performed for millions. Won Grammys. Got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But he never stopped thinking about Marcia. She was the one who taught him about harmony. About listening beneath the melody. Every time he performed Sweet Caroline, the song he'd written while they were still married, he remembered the way she used to sing the harmony line. The notes only she knew were there. Marcia never remarried. She taught music in Boston for 35 years. She went to Neil's concerts when he came to town, always sitting far enough back that he wouldn't see her, singing along quietly, finding the harmonies. She never approached him. Never sent letters. Never tried to reconnect. Their time had passed. She'd made peace with it. Until 3 months ago. Marcia was diagnosed with lung cancer. Stage 4. The doctors gave her 6 months, maybe less. She'd lived a good life, she told herself. She'd taught hundreds of children to love music. She'd stayed true to who she was. But there was one thing she regretted. She never told Neil what his music meant to her. Not just when they were married, but after. All those years of sitting in audiences, finding the harmonies, feeling connected to him even from a distance. She never told him that his choice to chase his dream had been the right one. That she was proud of him. That the divorce hadn't been a failure but a gift, giving both of them permission to become who they needed to be. Her sister convinced her to write a letter. Marcia spent 3 weeks writing and rewriting it. Finally, she mailed it to Neil's management company, not expecting a response. 2 weeks later, her phone rang. It was Neil's assistant. Mr. Diamond had received her letter. He wanted to know if she'd be willing to come to New York. He was doing the Tonight Show. He'd like her to be there. Marcia almost said no. What was the point? They'd said goodbye 40 years ago. But then she thought, what if I could hear him play Sweet Caroline one more time? What if I could sing the harmony just once more, even if he doesn't know I'm there? She said yes. Behind the scenes, Neil had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. The Tonight Show staff had no idea why Neil Diamond insisted on having a specific guest in the audience. They just knew that Mr. Diamond had required actually, that a woman named Marcia Murphy be given a seat and that no one tell her he knew she was there. I want her to feel safe, Neil had told the producer. I want her to just be in the audience. Like old times. What Neil hadn't counted on was how his body would respond to hearing her voice again. When Marcia started singing the harmony from the back of the studio, she couldn't help herself. It was muscle memory after 40 years. Neil's entire world collapsed into that sound. That voice. Those specific notes, that only she had ever sung. His fingers had frozen on the guitar. His eyes had closed. And 40 years dissolved like they'd never happened. Now, on the Tonight Show stage, Neil Diamond and Marcia Murphy were staring at each other across a crowded studio, and everyone else had become invisible. Jimmy Fallon finally found his voice. Neil? Do you know this woman? Neil didn't take his eyes off Marcia. She's my first wife. I haven't seen her in 40 years. The audience gasped. Collectively. Audibly. 300 people suddenly understanding they were witnessing something far bigger than a musical performance. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Jimmy made a decision. He walked to the center of the stage and addressed the audience directly. Folks, I think we need to pause everything. Something real is happening here. He turned to Marcia, still standing in the back aisle. Ma'am, would you come down here? Marcia hesitated. This wasn't what she'd planned. She just wanted to sit in the audience. To hear him sing. To say goodbye in her own quiet way. But Neil extended his hand toward her. Please, he said, his voice breaking. Please, Marcia. The audience parted. People stood up, moving into the aisles to create a path. Marcia walked slowly through the studio, her hands trembling, until she reached the stage. Jimmy helped her up the steps. Neil met her at the edge, and for a long moment, they just looked at each other. You got my letter, Marcia said finally. Every word, Neil replied. Why didn't you tell me you were sick? Because I didn't want pity. I wanted to hear you sing one more time. Neil's hands were shaking as he reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, worn piece of paper, sheet music, handwritten, yellowed with age. I wrote this the week after you left, he said quietly. The harmony line to Sweet Caroline. The one you always sang. I never published it. I kept it because it was yours. He handed it to her. Marcia looked down at the notes. Her notes, the ones she'd sung in their apartment 40 years ago, now preserved in Neil's handwriting. Sing it with me, Neil said. One more time. The way it was supposed to be. Jimmy stepped back. The Roots stayed silent. The audience was crying. Neil picked up his guitar. Marcia stood beside him, holding the sheet music with trembling hands. They sang Sweet Caroline together. Neil on melody, Marcia on harmony. Their voices blending the way they had 4 decades ago, imperfect with age but perfect in memory. When the final note faded, the audience exploded. Standing ovation. Tears everywhere. Jimmy Fallon was openly sobbing. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Neil kept that harmony sheet music in his guitar case. Marcia passed away 7 weeks later, peacefully, with Neil holding her hand. At her funeral, he sang Sweet Caroline one last time, and her students, now adults, sang the harmony she taught them. The sheet music is now framed in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Below it, a plaque reads, "Some harmonies wait a lifetime to be heard again."